Hello, everyone. Welcome again. This is the Inter-American Dialogue's discussion on race and policing in the United States and Brazil. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program. Really great that so many of you could join us this afternoon. For many of us here in Washington, where I am, and really across the United States, the 2 months since the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police have been a time of pain and protest, and also of reflection on the work that remains to be done to address racial injustice in our country. George Floyd's killing was only the latest in a pattern of police killings of Black Americans. His death followed those of Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and too many others. What is different about Floyd's murder is that even in the midst of a global pandemic, millions of Americans took to the streets to demand accountability, police reform, and an end to systemic racism. Here at the Inter-American Dialogue, we have been particularly attuned to the ways in which the outrage at George Floyd's murder reverberates beyond US borders, particularly in places where the manner of his death resonates with communities similarly victimized. In the Americas, this is perhaps particularly the case in Brazil, which shares with the United States a tragic history of slavery, institutional racism, and police violence. Today, we will examine the context and causes, the similarities and differences, and the progress and pushback around issues of race and policing in the United States and Brazil. We will do so with the benefit of 3 outstanding panelists who are some of the foremost experts in the US and Brazil on anti-Black police violence, human rights, and public safety. Professor Kristen Smith of the University of Texas, Alexandra Montgomery of Amnesty International Brazil, and Dr. Melina Risso of the Igarapé Institute in Rio de Janeiro. I will fully introduce our panelists shortly, but first it's my really enormous pleasure to welcome the Honorable Joaquin Castro to open this conversation for us. Congressman Castro was first elected to the US House of Representatives in 2012 to represent Texas's 20th Congressional District. He currently serves as the Vice Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and also serves on its Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. Congressman Castro has spoken eloquently about the way in which communities of color in the United States experience policing, and after the murder of George Floyd, he introduced legislation to require law enforcement to track and report the use of force by police. So really, he's uniquely placed to help us frame today's conversation, and we're so delighted he was able to join us to provide his perspective on these urgent issues. Congressman, again, truly a privilege to welcome you back again to the Inter-American Dialogue. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for all the work that y'all are doing. It's great to be here with all the panelists, and want to offer a few words of welcome and of context. And as Michael mentioned, I'm Joaquin Castro, and I represent the 20th District of Texas in Congress, and I'm Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and also serve on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. I'm also Chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus in the House of Representatives. And thank you for inviting me to speak with you all today. I want to thank the Inter-American Dialogue and its Rule of Law program for hosting this important event on race and policing in the United States and Brazil. And thank you to the outstanding speakers for providing their critical perspectives. I have no doubt this is a very necessary and will be a very fruitful discussion. As we've witnessed over the past several months, the issue of police violence has given rise to massive protests across the United States. These protests symbolize the mounting frustration that many people feel about the systemic racism that exists within our public institutions, most prominently our law enforcement system. I understand that Brazil shares this pain and this problem. While people took to the streets in the United States to march for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, for instance, communities in Brazil were mourning and protesting the killing of João Pedro Matos Pinto, a 14-year-old Afro-Brazilian boy murdered by the police there. As you know, Brazil and the United States share many historical parallels. Both countries must reckon with the history of slavery, and we must strive to eradicate systemic racism and to perfect our democracies. The racism that plagues policing in both of our nations results in the disproportionately high rates of police violence against Black and brown men and women. The Latino community in the United States has also suffered from police brutality. Andres Guardado, Carlos Lopez. Those are some of the names that are the latest to be killed. I must highlight that in the United States, cases of police violence against our Afro-Latino brothers and sisters, who make up 25% of Latinos in the United States, are often unreported. The injustices they face for being both Latino and Black must be stopped. Rates of police killings in Brazil and the US are striking and on the rise. In the US, according to a Washington Post report, nearly 1,000 people are shot and killed each year by the police. In Brazil, studies show that though Afro-Brazilians make up 55% of the population, they account for 75% of those killed by police. This disparity is unacceptable. Equally alarming is the trend towards militarization that's occurring in the police departments of both nations. Just last week, we looked on in dismay and fright as protesters in Portland, Oregon were beaten, targeted with pepper spray, and thrown into unmarked cars by federal agents in fatigues. In Chicago, police officers knocked the teeth out of a Black teenage girl's mouth for filming a protester's arrest. In Brazil, this past May, a 14-year-old boy was shot to death during an armed raid by police in the Rio suburb, São Paulo. These images do not live up to the aspirations of either Americans or Brazilians, or the democratic society we fight to maintain every day in our countries. Without proper accountability measures and oversight, this police violence will continue to result in thousands of senseless deaths each year. Police officers in the United States and Brazil alike must be held accountable for their actions. And the impunity that they've enjoyed for decades must finally come to an end. How do we accomplish this? We must come together to fix the underlying causes of systemic racism in both countries, such as access to education, disenfranchisement, and the lack of equal opportunity, in order to better focus on one of racism's deadliest symptoms, the disproportionate killing of brown and Black people by the police. I am proud to have supported the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and if we're successful in passing it, if the United States Senate will take action on it and the president will sign it, I hope we will save Black and Latino lives in this country. The United States and Brazil share other struggles as well. Just as Americans must confront the legacy of racism, so too must we confront the inequities that have contributed to the conditions that allowed our countries to come to where they are. I want to say thank you all for putting on this discussion, for thinking about how we can combat these challenges in the United States and Brazil, and to think about a future in both our countries where systemic racism doesn't guide the opportunities of the young children who today look at their nation and wonder where they fit in and whether they'll have the opportunities that they seek. So thank you all very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Congressman. Thanks so much for those very probing and very sobering remarks. I think you've really set the stage for what I'm sure will be an enlightening conversation. So we are grateful, as always, for your collaboration with the Inter-American Dialogue, for your leadership on these issues, and for your service to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere. So I know you have a busy day and a lot of commitments, and we'll need to drop off at some point. But thanks again for being with us and sharing your thoughts. And we look forward to hosting you again soon at the Dialogue.
Absolutely. Love joining. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to turn now to our panel, which, as I mentioned, we're privileged to be joined by Kristen Smith, who's an associate professor of African and African American diaspora studies and anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, by Alexandra Montgomery, who is director of programs at Amnesty International in Brazil, and by Melina Risso, who is program director at the Igarapé Institute in Rio de Janeiro. Their bios are very impressive and very long. They're all available on our website, so I would encourage you to look at those. I'll just mention here that all three of them, have lived and worked in both Brazil and the United States. So they all bring, in addition to their subject matter expertise, a real binational perspective on these issues to the conversation. I want to remind participants that you can follow this event on Twitter at #PoliceViolenceAmericas and at the Dialogue. we invite participants to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, using the event hashtag on Twitter, or to email questions to meetings@thedialogue.org. And the way we're going to do this is I will moderate a conversation for the first part of the event, and then we'll turn to the questions that you're submitting via Zoom or via Twitter or via email. So we'll save those for the latter part of our conversation. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the conversation here, starting with Professor Smith, if I could. Professor, you've done a lot of academic work on anti-Black state violence and community responses in Brazil. So you're very well placed to speak to all sides of this conversation. But I would like to start here in the United States. You've written and spoken about police violence against Black Americans and its traumatic effect on Black communities. So I wonder if you could just start by reflecting on the events of the last couple of months, what they tell us about the way that communities of color are policed in the United States, and also what the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement means in the context of combating systemic racism in the US.
First, let me say thank you for having me here, Michael, and to the Inter-American Dialogue. And thank you to all my fellow panelists for sharing a virtual panel with me today as well, and to all of those that are tuning in. I would like to begin by quoting or paraphrasing the words of James Baldwin to really kind of lead into an answer to your question, which is, my feelings around this current moment, ever since the tragic killing of George Floyd, is that we are experiencing a moment in the United States that is as devastating as it is beautiful. And what do I mean by that? And like I said, that's a paraphrase of James Baldwin. It is as devastating as it is beautiful, primarily because we are literally seeing the worst of times and the best of times at this moment. I, like the rest of my community here in the United States, was utterly paralyzed and undone by the public lynching of George Floyd. And I use those words very carefully and very deliberately, primarily because what for many of us in the Black community, when we saw his death and his excruciating death repeated over and over again on the media, we could not help but remember the long legacy of public killings and public lynchings of Black people here in the United States, and the way that has deeply affected our communities intergenerationally for years. And so that was a moment that most of us will not forget. I could not bring myself to watch the entire video. Every time I see snippets of it, it gets caught in my throat because it is that painful. But on the other side of that pain, we've also seen young people and people of all backgrounds from the entire country and the entire world come together and engage in unprecedented protests and actually push for unprecedented changes and achieve levels of change that I myself never thought I would see in my lifetime, to be quite frank with you. And so that is the beautiful element of it. And I think that what we are seeing now is truly a watershed moment. I'm struck by the fact that Angela Davis has been reflecting on what she has been seeing, and she has seen so much. And even for her, she feels that this moment is different. And she said that repeatedly over the past few months. And so I think that right now what we are witnessing is an important sea change in the United States and in the world. And I say in the world, and I'll get more into this later, but I say in the world primarily because my work has really led me to push people to remember. And I'm sure my colleagues who will speak in a little bit will also touch on this, particularly with Brazil and the specifics in Brazil. But my work as somebody who is from the United States, but has worked in Brazil, who is a Black woman that goes back and forth between spaces, what I realize and what I know is that anti-Black policing is transnational. It is not a national problem. It is not a national issue. George Floyd's death, while it is local, and dealt and grounded in Minneapolis and grounded in Houston, Texas, which is just up the street from where I live, about 3 hours away. What is grounded in, it's grounded in our reality here in the United States. It is also very, very familiar across the Americas. And I think the congressman pointed to that by talking about the deaths that have happened in Brazil. But I also want to emphasize that if we are to truly seize this political moment and to really address the crisis of anti-Black policing and to actually move past some of the rhetoric and the discourse that gets us into a sound chamber, then we really must recognize that this is a transnational issue. And so solving things here in the United States and focusing only on our local context will not undo this problem. This is something that is transnational. It is rooted in the roots of slavery that are across the Americas. As we all know, policing as we know it comes out of the tradition of slave patrols. And that is true in the United States, and it is true in Brazil. And so what we are seeing when we're talking about people calling for defunding the police and calling for abolition and pushing for change, real serious change, what we are seeing is truly a return back to, or a call to return back to some of the roots of our national identities in this hemisphere that are grounded in the experience of anti-Blackness and slavery and anti-indigeneity and colonialism, and really recognize that we must undo policing as we know it in order to move forward and to create harmonious societies. And so for me, I think that this moment around George Floyd's death and the protests that have come as a result of it really do remind me of those things. They remind me of what is devastating about this nation and about this hemisphere, what is beautiful about the struggle that we all have organized over these years, and what is possible if we are truly to get past the rhetoric of some of the traditional ways we understand policing.
Thank you, Professor. That was powerful and poignant, and you raised a lot of issues that I want to come back to. Let me turn now to Alexandra Montgomery, and I want to pick up on this issue of transnationality and some of the ways in which there may be parallels between the cases of the U.S. and Brazil. Maybe one place a very particular place to start, Alexandra, may be the recent video that many of us, I'm sure, saw of a white police officer in Sao Paulo standing on the neck of a 51-year-old Black woman. And the parallels with the video of George Floyd were both sort of immediately obvious and extremely disturbing. And maybe through the lens of that video, or more broadly, that the congressman mentioned some of the recent cases that we've seen in Brazil. Can you offer some thoughts on the way that Afro-Brazilians experience policing and experience police violence, and reflect also on the extent to which George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement have resonated in Brazil?
Thank you, Michael. I think, thank you. First, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this dialogue. And I think it is very important and needed, and all these parallels that we can draw from what we've been experiencing here in Brazil and in the United States can give us a few issues to think about and to discuss more further and see how we can improve our movement and our struggle in both countries. I think picking up on what the professor just said, one of her last points is that the police was created in order to deal with the slaves. That's very much the case here in Brazil. We know that historically during the colonial times, when police was created, it was created to protect property and to protect the white property. And I think this is one of the first points that leads us to how racist and how anti-Black police can be in Brazil. I think drawing the parallels related to the police brutality with that 51 years old woman in São Paulo, we can work backwards and we can see that this is the way that the police acts in Brazil and all throughout that. Congressman mentioned the case of João Pedro. Congressman Castro mentioned the case of João Pedro, the 14 years old boy who was killed and then took in a helicopter and sent to another place, and then disappeared for a good 8 hours, and one was only found by his family 8 hours later in a place where in the morgue. We can also refer to the killing of Misael, a 13 years old boy in Ceará, while he was sleeping in his aunt's house. We can talk about the killing of Cláudia Ferreira in Rio de Janeiro in 2014, a woman who was dragged for 300 meters on the streets by a police car. And we can go to Bahia and to the enforced disappearance of Davi Fiuza in 2015. So it is a pattern, it is systematic. And for what we see, it is very hard to change how police do policing in Brazil, especially because it is very much racialized in an anti-Black way. So as it happens in the US, here, how do we deal with police violence and policing in large is very similar to the way that you deal with that in the United States, or Black communities deal with that in the United States. So we have to prepare our children for the very difficult conversation that you also have in the United States, that they have to learn to fear the police from the beginning since they're little. And it doesn't matter if they're boys or girls. If they're Black, that's what matters, right? So because the way the police approaches people, many of them children or youth, is very aggressive. So we had, as Amnesty International, a campaign in 2015 that said those exact names, exact numbers that Congressman mentioned. 75% of people who were killed in Brazil were Black, and that at every or each 23 minutes, a Black young person was killed by minute. So for us, it is important to understand or to speak out and let people know how hard it is to just be Black in Brazil. It doesn't matter the state where you are or the urban community, if you live in an urban community or in a rural community, it is very much racialized. And to deal with this, what we can say is that the Black movement, the favela movement, the mothers of victims of violence from the state violence, they have always been active, and they have always been speaking out and pressing and mobilizing against police brutality. I think the Black Lives Movement, George Floyd's murder, and other murders in the United States have also created opportunities for both movements to find ways to resist and to exchange tactics on the same struggle, and how we can face this issue and how we can really deal with them in the two different countries.
Terrific. Thank you, Alexandra. Melina Riso, let me turn to you and again, sort of pick up on some of these issues that were raised with regard to just the kind of staggering extent of police violence in Brazil and its disparate racial impact. So just to quote one study, the Brazilian police killed in 2018, 6,220 people, 3 or 4 of whom were Black. That's roughly 6 times the number killed in the United States by police, which obviously has a much larger population. So I guess the questions are twofold. First, what explains this epidemic of police violence in the country? And second, is the disparate racial impact of this violence evidence of systemic racism in Brazilian policing?
Unmute this. Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to share this panel with the panelists. And let me try to address the question. I think the first point to emphasize and recognize is that police kill too much in Brazil. As you mentioned, just in 2018, it was more than 6,000 people killed by the police. And we've seen this repeatedly through the years, and it's increasing. So we had an amazing increase from 2017 to 2018, and it is different among the states. So the other thing is to understand that however police kills too much, it's necessary to understand there is a lot of difference between Brazilian police among the states. In Brazil, the main responsibility for the police is the state is at the state level. So it's most of the governors controlling the police, and the perspective and the policy they assure for the police, it changes, and we can see this change through all the states. So let's try to look at this phenomenon a little bit further. Like Rio de Janeiro police, it's one that kills most in absolute numbers. In 2018, Rio police killed alone 1,500 people, and in 2019, 1,800. In this pandemic, we saw in May and March and April is still an increase in the police killings in the favela. Which means that the kind of policing, the kind of operations that police do, it results in these amazing killings. When we see the numbers and the percentage, what represents police killing among the total amount that intentional killings in Brazil, it's also different. In the state of Rio, 23% of all intentional killings that happen in the state is committed by the police. When we look at the São Paulo numbers, 20% of the total intentional killing are committed by the police. So the state kill a lot. And this brings a really challenge for the policing and in terms of the legitimacy of the police. Of course, people don't trust the police and they have different experience. And we do have different policing in rich parts of the cities and poor parts of the cities. And of course, all the experience that white people have with the police and the experience that Black people have with the police are really different. So we have a really challenge in the way that we think the policing, the way that the policy is taken from every state, and the results that we realize in terms of the results of the policing. So even in the states that we are decreasing the homicides number, the violence, robbery, and everything, is still the police kills a lot. So this is something that we have to address in Brazil. And as long as the society understands that the deaths, not just the society, but also the states, understand that these deaths are considered acceptable as a casualty of the operation, we are going to have these really high numbers. So we really have to address. And regarding the racism, what studying the police and talking to them, this is a really invisible issue in Brazil. It's really hard to address publicly the racism problem that is really entrenched in our society, in our culture, but it's not really discussed. It's kind of invisible, and people don't really want to address and recognize how much racism we do have in all institutions across Brazil. And what the killing of George Floyd brings to Brazil is an opportunity to start to address this issue more publicly, and everyone start to address and discuss and understand really, because the first thing we have to acknowledge how much racism we do have in our institutions and we do have in Brazilian society, that it's not a way of Brazilian to discuss the problem as it is.
That's terrific, Melina. I guess, thank you for that. And it's actually a perfect segue to Professor Smith, who, Professor, I'd like to ask you to help us connect this reality of anti-Black police violence in the U.S. to what we see in Brazil. Certainly, we've discussed some of the historic and contemporary parallels between the two countries, but there are enormous differences, of course, including just in the way that the two countries sort of conceive of race. And I think Dr. Risso's point that these issues are invisible to an extent in Brazil is an interesting one. So maybe I'd like to ask you, from your perspective, what do you see as the most important parallels between the US and Brazil, but also the relevant differences as we consider this issue?
Thank you. I think that I always struggle with this particular question, and this is why. Because on the one hand, I appreciate the kind of traditional perspective that associates Brazil with racial democracy, and that kind of frames, I think, particularly, cultural historians of Brazil and the United States have always looked at the two countries as kind of opposites when it comes to race and our perspectives on race. But I would like to offer a bit of a different perspective. And specifically, I would like to really push us to consider the fact that the rhetoric around, or the discourse around colorblind racism, or the discourse around colorblindness here in the United States that we particularly see emerging out of the 1970s and as a reactionary right response to the successes of the civil rights movement, shifted the culture of how we talk about race in the United States quite significantly. So much so that it really became taboo to talk about race or racism, or to be somehow associated with race or racism generally. And why do I bring that up? Because I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure people probably know of the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, where she really does an excellent job of breaking down the history of the criminal justice system and its close relationships with anti-Blackness in the United States and racism in the United States. And one of the things that she highlights is the ways that the war on drugs was framed in the United States around a discourse of colorblindness. So much so that talking about race when it comes to the criminal justice system in the United States has become completely taboo. You cannot, for example, bring a defense case if you are wrongfully accused of something. You cannot bring a defense case to court that claims that you are the victim of racism. That is not admissible. And so because that's not admissible, why? Because the Supreme Court decided in the McCleskey case that racism, the accusation that the criminal justice system is racist, is not an admissible defense for somebody who feels they have been wronged by that system. Why do I go around in all of those different things? Because I think that Brazil and the United States are much more similar than many of us would like to really truly grapple with. And I think particularly over the past 30, if not 50 years, but particularly 30 years, as Brazil has really moved to address things like affirmative action, and even the genocide of Black youth, which was a federal platform under the Dilma administration, then we see that Brazil definitely talks about race, and Brazil definitely talks about Blackness, and is very aware of the fact that Black people are the disproportionate victims of police violence and police killings in Brazil. That being said, what we're seeing, and this is something that sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva talks about as well, is kind of, he calls it the Latin Americanization of the United States, where the United States, and you know, there are lots of different opinions on the extent to which this is true, but I think that in this, I would definitely agree with him. The United States has really kind of adopted a discourse of racial democracy, particularly when it comes around criminal justice and policing. And I think that what we're seeing right now, and that really happened in the 1980s and 1970s, as I mentioned, and particularly the 1990s. And what we're seeing right now with Black Lives Matter is a response to that and a pushback to that. And so that is a very kind of historical way to say that I think that the big differences that I see between policing in Brazil and the United States is not necessarily the question of the discourse of race that surrounds it. Because I think in both cases, you have structural anti-Blackness that is embedded within the criminal justice system. And I use anti-Blackness specifically because it's not just racism writ large. And I also think that sometimes we misdefine racism as interpersonal enmity, meaning interpersonal prejudice against one another. And so then when we think about it that way, then unless a white police officer kills a Black person and uses a racial epithet in that particular scenario, then we don't think of that scenario as racist. And I really want us to push away from that and think about anti-Blackness because it's structural, and it is also a way for us to understand the ways that implicit and explicit bias factor into this. And so, and I think in both Brazil and the United States, you have ample evidence that shows that both implicit and explicit bias lead to the disproportionate impact of police killings on Black communities, the widespread stereotypes that Black people are somehow more criminal, that Black people are degenerate, that Black people are marginal, that Black people are poor and drug dealers. These are discourses, stereotypical discourses that you find in Brazil and the United States. And both of those discourses are used to not only build policy, but to also shape the way that the culture of policing functions. And so that is to me, one of the direct parallels. So it's not just about the roots in slave patrols. It is also the ways that policing as we know it in Brazil and the United States has been justified on the demonization of Black people. And that is the case for both of those places. And in both of those places, and I really want to emphasize this point, that demonization of Black people has been euphemized as not being about Blackness. And so in Brazil, you have terms like favela, favelado that are used as opposed, and here in the United States, it's ghetto and urban. And both of those terms are trigger words that are used to signal Blackness and to mark spaces as criminal, expendable, and people as killable. And so I think that that's something that I really want to emphasize as a similarity. Now, in terms of differences, and I'll make this very, very brief, in terms of differences, I think one of the biggest differences that I see in my work and looking at policing in both places is actually the ways that extrajudicial killings happen, or the ways that you have death squads that are very much a part of policing culture in Brazil. That's something you don't have in the United States, although Portland looks like it's about to move in that direction. So that is very much a legacy of the military dictatorship. It's a legacy of the relationship between the military police, or the military and the police in Brazil. And it's something that we don't necessarily see. The way that policing is associated with traffic stops and drug control in the United States has really been more about street patrol, right? And in Brazil, it's been more of a militarized invading force approach that has also spilled over its boundaries into this kind of militarized, clandestine, off-duty, quote unquote, police officers going to people's houses in the middle of the night, abducting them, torturing them, and killing them. And so to me, those are the differences, but I really want to emphasize that I see more similarities than I do see differences.
Thank you, Professor. Those are excellent points, really compelling. And again, a lot to, I think, continue to dig in on. Alexandra, I want to ask you specifically about Rio de Janeiro state, where you're located. Melina mentioned some of the disparities or the differences geographically within Brazil when it comes to police violence. Rio is, I think, by all accounts, sort of the epicenter including, and it's a place where we can see some of the dynamics, I think, that Professor Smith was mentioning. Just to throw out one statistic, in the first half of 2019 alone, the Rio de Janeiro State Police killed 881 people, almost as many as in the United States as a whole, 80% of whom were Black. The New York Times published an expose this past May about policing in Rio entitled "License to Kill," in which it looked specifically at about 50 incidents of police killings and found that in at least half of them, victims had been shot in the back. So I wonder if you could just talk to us about the particular dynamics that you see in Rio, why it's so acute there, and then maybe also tell us about this recent Supreme Court decision and the impact that it has had on police violence in Rio.
Thank you, Michael. Well, let me start with this. Rio is a very violent state, but it's not the most violent state in Brazil in terms of police killing. We have other states that are as violent as Rio or more than Rio. If you look at the numbers of Goiás, if you look at the numbers of Pará, those states have also very high numbers of police killings and police lethality. I was talking just this morning with people in the Fórum de Segurança Pública, Fórum Brasileiro de Segurança Pública, and their numbers, and they were highlighting that, yes, Rio is horrible in terms of the numbers of police killings, but there are other states that also have very high numbers. I think here, when we say I wanted to reflect back on some things that Melina was saying in terms of the numbers and the difference that the police is controlled by states. And I think, well, yes, that's accurate. And I think it's important for us to understand that the data that is released by the states, the official data, is not uniform also. So on top of all the information on the way that each government, state government deals with the police, we see that they do not record the data of the killings in similar ways. So there is two dimensions here. There is what the numbers say, there is what is sub-notified, and there is also the feeling of the people that live there. So see, I will give you an example. In Ceará has historically a small number of police killings. But the number has increased in April, it increased to the rate of 150%. So, and when you look at this number was 35 people killed in 1 month. So it is a peak, but the numbers in comparison with other states, they are smaller. Also in Ceará, we cannot see the data disaggregated by race, because many people just don't fill out, many policemen, when you're dealing with this, they don't fill out the term certain information. The way that the state deals with transparency and how they inform the numbers of police lethality, like deaths that come from police killings, others say that's to be clarified or investigated. So you have two different components that you don't know if all those undetermined deaths are or are not caused by the police, because you have two different ways that they register that information. So all this to say that when you say 80% of the people that were killed by the police were Black in Rio, we have Rio as the third country, the third state with the highest number of Black people. You're gonna have Salvador as the first one, then you have São Paulo, then you have Rio. So it reflects the way that police polices the streets is also embedded with that vision that determine that certain people might be killable, as Professor said. So for me, when we say, and I agree, if you ask anybody, oh, are you racist? They're likely to say no, especially even the police officers. So when Melina mentions there is an invisibility, that means that we are working on racism on an individual dimension, and because there is the feeling, because if you ask the mothers from the movement of mothers of victims of the state, if you ask them whether the police is racist, they are likely to say that they are. So it depends on invisible to whom, because I feel that for Black people in this country, it is clear that not the individual policeman, but the way that the institution works in Brazil is profiled by, is permeated by a vision that certain kind of people are disposable, certain bodies are killable. So I think when we are talking about this way that they operate, this institution operates, we're gonna see that in its origins on how the police, the Brazilian police was, and again, talking about the similarities that Professor pointed out, we have a history of repression against certain people, right? During the last dictatorship that we had very specific attacks against the civilian population. When we reconstructed our memory from those times, we never took into account how the Black population was affected by the repression in Brazil by the military regime. There is nowhere in all the memory recollection that was created during the Dilma administration and Lula administration that took into account the race component of those killings. And we know that the way that people are killed and disappeared and have still being disappeared in the current days is an effect of how the military trained the National Intelligence Service was trained by the Americans, and how this reflects and how this was also transposed to the way that our military operates and the way that our police forces operate. So, and that's precisely what something that Professor mentioned that has to do with the death squads and the militias right now. This is something that has happened historically, and from the last dictatorship period that we experienced, we've seen many people from the military army and also the military police and the civil police very embedded with the organized crime, and the ways that these death squads were created and operated for years and created several massacres in Rio, in São Paulo. You have chacinas for everywhere here in Brazil, all throughout the end of the 80s and the 90s. And now we're still having to see them during police operations, and then undertaken by police in service, and not what they do during their death squads period. So I think, again, Rio is a very violent place. It has this ties with the militia. I think what particularly ties Rio with a very bad historical ways of operation is the ties with the death squads, and now with the militias. So I think I can stop here.
Thank you, Alexandra. Again, really excellent comments. Melina, I think one of the themes of this conversation thus far obviously has been just how kind of deeply rooted and structural many of these challenges are. But I want to ask you about a a more recent development, which is the election of President Bolsonaro in Brazil. He came to office as a kind of brash law and order president, promising to unleash the police against criminals. And I wonder, from your perspective, if it's possible to kind of characterize how security policy has evolved during his tenure, and if there's any evidence that police violence is getting better or getting worse since he came to office.
Thank you, Michael. But just before I address the question, I want to clarify my point. I completely agree with Professor Smith that we have more similarities than the differences between racism in Brazil and in the US. The thing is that as society, we don't recognize and we are not ready, and we don't do this discussion as openly as I saw in the American society. We have to do that. And it is really deep. And as you said, as you mentioned, Professor, you are completely right. The Black movement is doing this for a long period of time. They are discussing this, but this is for the Black movement is coming and trying to put this over the society. But how I feel is that the police is not willing to understand or to take the responsibility and to review and to address these structural issues. So it's not that we don't have, we do have, I completely agree. It's structural, is not individual, and we have to address this as a society. But the point is, discussing and working with the police, they are less willing to recognize and to address this issue from the root point, from what the operation means and how this affects the results that we see every day. And as we see every day, like the disproportion in terms of the bad policies that we have in all areas regarding regarding Black people, we have to address this as a society in Brazil. And I see this more openly addressed in the United States than it is, there's a whole debate in Brazil. So it's not a disagreement. I do agree, we have a lot of understanding and we have a lot of similarities, but how the institutions are dealing and are discussing this, I see this in a very different way. In the US, it's more openly, and in Brazil, unfortunately, we are not there yet. I think we are starting to discuss this. More people are pushing for this. For recent times, even the race perspective was not taken or collected as data for the police. So we cannot even understand the disproportion that is happening. So this is, we have a long way to go and to understand and to openly address the structural racism that we have in our society. So it's not a disagreement. Again, regarding what we have, is just how the institutions are dealing with this. And I see more openness in the US than I see in Brazil. I think we still, it's still a taboo in Brazilian institutions, and we have to push forward so we can discuss this more openly, so we can address. If you don't recognize that you have a problem, it's really difficult to address the problem if you don't think that you have one. So just to clarify my point, I wasn't disagreeing with the diagnosis of the structural racism that we have in the society. And regarding the president, Bolsonaro, what he came to office in a really tough perspective on security, and what we have saw for now until now, it's that they don't have in terms of security policy, they haven't presented anything. They are just pushing for two measures. The first one, it's like dismantling the control arms policy that we have in place in Brazil. So it has been his movement since the day one in the office, like increasing the numbers of guns that people can have and can have access to. And we know, and some of the data that we are looking at, the increasing of homicides again since the late 2019 and in the beginning of 2020, could reflect the amount of guns that are being to the market. And the other thing that the president has pushed is this license to kill, and like to allow police to kill without accountability or penalty. He's trying to flexibilize this, and this is very bad because police in Brazil, they are not used to be accountable. This is one problem that from the civil society perspective, all the time asking and pushing for accountability in terms of numbers, in terms of the at least transparency to understand all the laws, operations, rules, and everything. It's been really opaque. We cannot understand everything that is happening. And because police has large discretion, we saw this impact in the rhetoric that the president has on tough on crime, then is deliberate to kill and everything, in the numbers and in the perspective and an aspect of policing in the streets and everywhere. So I think it's in terms of security policy, the government, the federal government hasn't presented something that we can call a security policy, so we can understand what are the targets, what they are doing, what they are implementing, but only this dismantle about gun control policy that is put in place, and we are seeing a lot of guns and ammunitions going into the market, and we are going to face the consequences of that, but also this allowing police this license to killing for policing. And this is, he's trying to do this through the Congress, through the justice system, and also escaping the checks and balances that we have in Brazil. So this is his way of doing security policy that I wouldn't consider a security policy.
Thank you, Melina. That's great. Really, really clear. I just, while we're on this impunity point, I'd like to turn to Alexandra, because Alexandra, I assume you've come into direct contact with the system in your capacity as a lawyer, and in the U.S., police killings are sort of notorious for the level of impunity. 99% of police killings between 2013 and 2019 did not result in charges against the officers involved. There are reasons for that. Obviously, in some cases, the use of force is justified by the circumstances, but even when prosecutors want to bring charges, police officers are often protected by the terms of their union contracts or by particular kind of legal obstacles that make it difficult for charges to be brought. So with respect to the impunity point specifically that Melina raises in Brazil, are there similar kind of structural obstacles? What do you see in your work that stands in the way of greater accountability for police killings?
Well, I think in Brazil, the main problem is that officers that kill people, they do so because they fear no consequences. They know that they will not be prosecuted. They have this feeling that allows them to continue working on them and in this pattern or in this way. And that's because 90% of the cases where police have been accused of committing these crimes, at least in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, the rate is 90% of the cases that are that don't become are not prosecuted. The Ministério Público, the public prosecutor office, they archive 90% of the cases. So if you have been historically with a so violent police in a country that has been killing and nobody's being held accountable, this phenomenon will continue. So impunity is a problem when it intersects with a police that is already violent and they know that there will be no consequences, then this is a repetition of this pattern and of this systemic way of of acting. So I think because they know that there are no accountability for their actions, and there is a weak justice system that cannot prosecute, and the reasons for not prosecuting are the various. Many of them is because you can't pin the crime to the police sometimes, because they just change the crime scene. Sometimes it is as simple as that, and you cannot find conclusive evidence for the public prosecutor to actually go and prosecute the policemen that are the officers that are involved in those crimes. Many of the reasons might be related to the way that you can tie or pin who was in which action. The lack of accountability and control is so big that you can't find the evidence to even make it a case, or find witnesses to make it a case. So I think it has to do with the amount of power that they have on the circumstances in which these deaths happen, and how they know that they cannot, that if they change and if they tweak parts of these narratives also, they can get away with it. There are other elements that might be part of this, has to do with the justice system that will prosecute them. Now, in 2017, a law was passed, and part of the crimes that were committed during operations by people working together with the military federation during the federal intervention could be sent to the justice system. So we have the case of Davi Fiuza, for instance, that I mentioned, that happened. The case, with the legislative change, the case was sent to the military justice. So there is a misuse of the jurisdiction and who can prosecute and when, and which is the law applicable. So you just, sometimes the public prosecutor office just goes round and round because there's changes of jurisdiction, because there's changes, lack of evidence, and so on. And I think this just repeats. And now, if I may, I just wanted to mention, because you asked me in the last question about the decision from the Supreme Court, and I didn't get to comment on that. It's on that there was a decision in April. We had a 57% of increase of police lethality during the COVID. So in April this year, and then some groups here in Brazil presented a constitutional claim to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided on a precautionary measure to uphold and to prohibit all the police incursions in the favelas during the COVID, maintaining only for very exceptional cases and in situations that they had to communicate and then they had to report to the public prosecutor's office, justifying the reasons for that operation. And the results that we saw with that single external form of control of the police actions was a reduction of 75% on police lethality. And considering that the criminality rates or the crime rates weren't increased, and there were not necessarily a reduction on the number of operations, but just with that in mind, there was a decrease of 70% of the deaths on the favelas during this period. It was 177 in May and 36 after the decision. So that shows how prohibiting police to kill people sometimes works.
Great, thank you, Alexandra, and thank you for coming back to the Supreme Court question. I'm going to start turning to some of the questions we're receiving from audience members. Professor Smith, I'll turn to you maybe first. And I do want to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit towards the future and potential solutions for addressing the challenges that we've been analyzing. There's a couple of questions about, to the extent this is a transnational problem, or at least a problem in which you can see clear parallels, more similarities than differences, as you put it, Professor Smith, between the US and Brazil. A couple of questions that speak to, whether there's scope for transnational solutions as well. And specifically a mention of the US-Brazil Joint Action Plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination, which does not appear particularly kind of active at the moment, whether there's scope to revive that, whether that would be useful, and more broadly, is there an agenda potentially for the US and Brazil to work together on these challenges?
That's a really important question, and I think that it's a challenge right now. I think the answer to the question is twofold. On the one hand, you have the issue of political context, right, and policy, and then the other hand, we have community response, because I think that those, although they're starting to converge, I think that they're still quite different in their approaches. And so in terms of policy and in terms of politics, we're at a very difficult moment in both of our countries where I just don't see much hope on the horizon for progressive policy coalition building between our two governments. I think that we're both in similar situations where you have Bolsonaro and Trump very much in step with one another in all of the ways, and all the worst ways, to be really honest with you. And I think that both have really celebrated police violence. Both have kind of celebrated this reactionary right approach to repression of not only repression of freedoms writ large. And so it's tough when it comes to really trying to inject some energy into coalition building at the state level at this moment. I think that what is more hopeful and more heartening is thinking about transnational mobilization and solidarity among activists and among organizers. And so with regards to the United States, Black Lives Matter has never been just a national movement. There's always been conversations that have been transnational, and there's always been coalition building that's been transnational. On the other side of that, in terms of Brazil, the struggles that people have been engaging in, particularly within Black communities, and the multiple iterations of the Black movement, right? Because there's no such thing as the Black movement in Brazil, right? But Black movements in Brazil and Black militantes in Brazil have been in conversation with folk around the world about how do we address these issues. And I think that overwhelmingly across the board, it is clear that the way forward is on kind of a very Black feminist generated approach to abolition. And I think everybody's in agreement about that. We can't move forward without seeking abolition as a platform. And I think that that's a scary word for a lot of folk who have been traditionally engaged in more traditional approaches to policy. But again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I never thought I would hear the Minneapolis City Council say that it was going to defund the police. So the fact that we're talking about defund the police means that that is an abolitionist platform. So we're already on the road to talking about abolition. And I think I saw in the Q&A, somebody mentioned the fact that the structure of funding in Brazil for policing is different. And so defunding the police in Brazil doesn't make as much sense. I would actually disagree with that. Yes, of course, the funding is, the structure of funding is different. But despite the fact that are police officers underpaid in Brazil? Yes. But is policing underfunded in Brazil? Absolutely not. I mean, in Rio, you have people who have tanks, they have military grade weaponry, they have the most high tech, excuse me, forms of lethal weaponry available. And so when we talk about defunding the police, we're talking about taking away, excuse me, the absurd level of budgetary allocations that actually facilitate police lethality. Excuse me. And funding for military grade weaponry, which is part of the call that's transnational, I'm sorry, excuse me, to demilitarize the police is part of that defunding the police. So in Brazil, a few years back, people were very much talking about, and people still are talking about, the need to demilitarize the police forces. Demilitarizing the police forces is the same platform as defunding the police. Excuse me. And so I think in terms of transnational solidarity, and I'll have to get some water. I think in terms of transnational solidarity and transnational ways forward, we need to really lean into abolition as a transnational movement. And we need to understand that transnational abolition movement is about demilitarization necessarily being coupled with defunding, taking funds that are going to tanks and military grade weapons, and then rerouting them to education, rerouting them to mental health services. That can be done in Brazil, that can be done in the United States. What's blocking it is truly about public sentiment and political sentiment. And so I think that for those of us that are on the ground, really trying to make sure that these things that this energy continues, having transnational solidarity with movements to give that energy and to keep pushing for these platforms is important.
Great, thank you, Professor. We'll let you get some water, and I'm going to pick this up with Melina on the policy question in terms of police reform. I think Professor Smith spoke to the difficult kind of political environment, and he made a compelling argument for focusing on activism and building support for this abolitionist movement that she talked about. But as think tankers, we can dream. And so I wonder, from your perspective, Melina, if you could imagine sort of an ideal agenda for police reform. In the US, since the George Floyd murder, there's been a lot of things talked about, everything from banning chokeholds to the debate about police body cameras to, as the professor mentioned, the movement to defund the police and everything that implies. I wonder, to what extent any of these ideas are present in the conversation in Brazil. What you think an appropriate agenda would look like in Brazil, and whether it's the same. Is it a case of kind of one size fits all, or does police reform in Brazil need to look different than it might in terms of what we're discussing here in the States?
Well, Michael, I think the discussion about police reform in Brazil, it's very specific, because we do have the military police, and they are like a part of the army. And it means that although we do have funds in different ways, like the salary of the military officers, the police officers are completely different, and this spreads the budget a lot when we see, when we understand how the financing works in terms of personnel. It's very different, and it spreads a lot the state budget and all the pension system. So this is one thing that I think it's completely different in the US. So to discuss police reform in Brazil, it has to deal with the kind of police officers that we have, because this comes to the fund as well. So the personnel and how this works. But in terms of, I'd like to think much more in terms of a security policy, a safety policy, than just police reform, because I think the key point, it's when we think about violence and reduce violence, the only thing that we can think of is just the criminal justice system, or the police, or criminal justice system. And we have to think more in terms of prevention. How can we prevent, and how can we invest in social policies that come forward and impede? And we think about security and prevention in a different way. So I think we have to shift only for police. Of course, we have to reform the police, have to reduce and training more the criteria for entering the ideal and the value, what the police is for. This is another discussion that we have to deal with. But also we have to understand, at least in Brazil, in terms of the prevention policy that is not taking place. We don't see all the policies that we have to do in terms of labor, in terms of housing, in terms of schooling, in terms of health, assistance and social health. So everything that comes that we can reduce inequality in a much deeper way to face and to give the equal opportunity. If we just discuss the police and the criminal justice system, I think we are just going to be in the same cycle, and we have to change and to understand that the big intervention and the big finance that we need is to understand how we invest in prevention policies and we reduce inequalities that we have across the board. So I think this is one way of thinking, not just how the police is working. Of course, we have to deal with that, but I would like to see more, how can we understand all the opportunities and equalities in a much broader way and structure this so we can give the opportunity for everyone to develop in a healthy way.
Thank you, Melina. I think to your point about thinking about these issues more holistically, perhaps, we have a question which I think maybe I'll direct to Alexandra as our resident lawyer. There's a question about access to attorneys, especially at the early stages of detention. Certainly a challenge that we're seeing in places like Portland now with as the Congressman mentioned. Are there similar challenges in Brazil in terms of guaranteeing constitutional rights by providing opportune access to legal counsel for detainees? Is that something you see as a challenge, and are there any steps being taken to address it?
Yes, well, historically we have so I can answer that in two ways. There is the way that it should be and the way that actually happens, right? So yeah, everybody should have the access to an attorney when that's what the Constitution says, that once you're deprived of your liberty, you're taken to the police station, and then there you have the right to have an attorney. The public defender's office in Brazil, we have a public defender's office who can go and support people. And we also have the Bar Association that has some volunteers that can work on that and providing legal defense to people. The amount of people that are detained is so huge that you can't necessarily have that access immediately. So one thing that happened in Brazil was a legislative change that created a step which is called Agência de Custódia. It's the custody hearing that you are before a judge, and then someone from the public defender's office comes and supports you and represents you in this process. It's just the first step, and it should happen no longer than 24 to 48 hours after you're detained to analyze your condition and see whether you were subjected to torture and so on. Now, in this moment, all of them, there is a discussion where these hearings are conducted through a virtual or video conference because of the COVID, the pandemic. But there has been historically a big difficulty for people to be released in certain cases when they mention that they were brutally treated or ill-treated by police forces. Another scenario is once the police is intervening in these communities, something that might happen is something similar to what happened to João Pedro. The person will not survive to be able to be arrested, right? The way that the police acts, especially when they're in certain territories of the city, is very different. So what we say is in Zona Sul of Rio de Janeiro, it's unlikely that a person that is detained, that they will not be sent to a police station. When you're talking about the peripheral areas or the Black territories, the historically known as Black territories, as the favelas, it is not very much likely that they will have all those guarantees in place. And that's what I'm talking about, the factical situation. Of course, that if you ask, let's say if you ask for a Freedom of Information Act way, if you ask them, they will have the policy, they will give you the numbers, but the problem is what is not said or what is not registered. So for us, access to having legal defense is still something very, very critical, especially because sometimes most of these people that are apprehended, many of them are injured, tortured, and don't even get to a police station alive. So I think that the conversation has to unfold a little bit further to understand from the perspective of those people living there, that if they are lucky to get to a police station alive, they are in a better place than many of their brothers.
Terrific, very, very clear. Thank you, Alessandra. We're almost at the end of our time. We have a lot of questions, unfortunately, that I'm not going to get to, but I'd like to just formulate a couple more and let Professor Smith and Dr. Risso respond as they wish. The first question is about civilian and military police and the distinction between the two, the extent to which they work together, and whether distinguishing between them is sort of a useful thing to be doing from the perspective of addressing the issues that we've been discussing. And the second has to do with training. Specifically looking at structural racism, anti-Black killings by police, whether better training is part of the solution, whether there's evidence for that, either in the US or Brazil. And Professor Dr. Risso, I know you've worked in places like Colombia as well. So if there are experiences that you can bring to bear or perspectives that could speak to the issue of police training as part of the solution to the challenges that we've highlighted. So maybe I'll turn to Melina first, and then we'll conclude with Professor Smith.
All right, thank you, Michael. In terms of, in Brazil, we have the civil and the military police, and they have different roles. And in terms of the cycle of policing from patrolling to investigation, we do have a lot of trouble, we do have a lot of problems, because usually these two institutions, they don't work together, they are competing most of the time. So if you don't have a structure to make them to work together, so we can complete and look at the the numbers, what one police do and the other one, what one police does and the other one, they are really interdependent. And the fact that they don't work together in Brazil, it's a huge problem in different states. And you have different structures that try to solve this problem, but it's not, we're seeing some good results in some of the states, and some of the states are really bad results, such as Rio. They just dismantle all the public safety public security secretary that was doing all the planning so they can work together. So it has been a challenge in Brazil. And in terms of training, it is really different in Brazil, the training that police officers have between the spectrum of the police. There are some states that when a police officer enters to the police, they have 3 months of training. Some others, they have 2 years of training. So it depends, and it differs a lot. But I would say it's not just the training, as we were saying, something that is really structural. It's not just the training that can solve the problem. We have to make a much larger and much deep discussion. And I don't see, at least in Brazil, police recognizing that they have this huge and entrenched problem in terms of racism. And what I would bring, it's not just the training, it's also the supervision and all the controlling that we have of policing. It's not just internally what the police are capable of doing, but also the external supervision that we have, that in Brazil, it's very fragile. Like the prosecution office that's supposed to do the external supervision of the police, it's not well done. So everyone in the spectrum are failing on that. It's not just the police, but it's the prosecution office, also the judiciary system, and also the whole society, because some of the times part of the society applaud police violence. And we have to change this, because if we don't have security for everyone, we can now have security for if everyone doesn't have the security as the same, we can now have security for the whole society. So it's not something that you can just have in the south zone of Rio de Janeiro, for example. Don't have the favelas. You have to be safe anywhere you are in the country. So you cannot have this difference that we still have in Brazil. So supervision, not just training, but also internal, external supervision and controlling from the society, because society has to play a role much deeper and much stronger that they are doing. It's not, this is a problem of everyone. It's not just Black movements. It's a problem of the Brazilian society as the whole process. So we have to control, we have to ask, have to pressure, and you have to make the police accountable in Brazil.
Thank you, Melina. Professor Smith, last word to you.
And I'll be brief. And I think that my first response to the question about military versus civil police, and I think civilian police is a misnomer. I think it's military police and civil police, and because there's 3 branches: federal, military, civil. I think it's really tough to kind of wade into the waters of thinking that somehow the internal functions of the police forces and their rivalries and their entanglements have exempt them from the conversation around anti-Blackness. The military police is anti-Black, the civil police is anti-Black, and the federal police are anti-Black. And all of them engage with Black people and with Black spaces in similar ways, meaning they mark those spaces as expendable and killable. They do it differently, they enact it differently, but they all have their hands dirty in this. And I think we would be remiss not to really acknowledge that. And I think in terms of police training, and just quickly, and I think that going back to Alexandra's point earlier, you know, for those that are interested in the roots of policing in Brazil, I really encourage you to read more about how we got to the point we have 3 branches of the police office, and how that is an outgrowth of the military dictatorship and the breakdown of policing and the military in the wake of the dictatorship at the end of the 1980s, and the way that has also rooted in the histories that Alexandra was bringing up earlier about the relationship to tortures and disappearances, et cetera. But in terms of training, you know, training is a really difficult issue. And I think this is something that I have grappled with in terms of here in the United States and thinking about it in Brazil. And I think here in the United States, places like Center for Policing Equity have really made noble efforts to try to train police officers not to be racist. They themselves would say that that's an impossible task. Because the issue is not whether or not people think Black people are bad, or whether or not people think that what they're doing is correct. What's the issue is how is policing structured, as Melina pointed out, and training, unfortunately, is not going to undo the structure and the logic of policing. And that is true in the United States, and that is true in Brazil. And I think that one quick thing that I'll say just to close my remarks is to say that we can't forget that anti-Black policing is an ideology. It's a structure. It is an identity. And so it's when we're talking about abolition, part of the reason why we talk about abolition and really undoing the structural ideology of anti-Black policing is because the very notion of policing itself is dependent on anti-Blackness. It's not as if one can be a police officer as the way one has always been and continue in that and somehow not continue to reproduce anti-Blackness. We have to reimagine this, and we have to reimagine the way that it works. And unfortunately, in both Brazil and the United States, it's caught up with power and money and corruption and all kinds of issues that make this very messy and complicated. And so I'll close by saying there was a brief attempt about 10 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, to bring in police training for explicit and implicit bias in Brazil, and in some of the traditions that we've had here in the United States. And that didn't go over very well because of the implications that would have had for the police forces that were involved in it. And so there are many powerful forces at play that don't want policing as we know it in Brazil or the United States to change. And so those forces don't want people, the anti-Blackness, to be rooted out from policing. And I think that we would be remiss to not mention that, and not to mention that there's a reason why we're still talking about this. There are people who are very much invested in seeing policing continue as it is, because it supports structures of power and circulations of power that are in some people's best interests, or in some people's invested interest. And so it's tricky, and we have to really be smart about how we move forward.
Terrific. Well, this has been such an enlightening conversation. I take a ton away from it. I'm sure everybody who accompanied us does as well. It's been, I think, at times a difficult and challenging conversation. And that's probably the way it should be when we deal with these issues. And so we are committed to continuing to have the conversation, and just so grateful that the 3 of you could spend an hour and a half with us, and that we can walk away with so much to think about in terms of the path forward. I want to thank my colleagues, Catherine Christie and Luisa Stahlman, who were really pivotal in helping to conceive and research this event. Again, really grateful for everyone who was able to accompanying us, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you again for joining us at the dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.